This is the Surviving Divorce webinar series. This is the first in the series. It is about the grieving process. And the key there is that it is a process. Grieving is not something that just you get over quickly. It's something that you have to work through. It's something that everyone faces going through divorce. Some people face it before the divorce happens. Some people face it after the divorce. My personal experience was that I was surprised by the divorce. So I started the grieving process long after my ex-wife did. And as a result, while I was deeply hurt and very emotional, she seemed cold because she'd already gone through the grieving process for the loss of the marriage, or much of it. So it is a process, and it's something that takes time. And we're going to get into that in a little more detail as we go. So let's get started. What is grief? We all basically understand what grief is, but dictionary.com defines grief as a keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss. It's sharp sorrow or painful regret. The divorce process is full of losses. There are many losses that happen in the divorce process, not just the loss of the marriage. There's a lot of other losses that happen. And divorce is something that's typically very fraught with grief. It can be debilitating grief. It can be disabling. And it's something that society as a whole doesn't do well with grieving after divorce. We expect a widow or a widower to grieve, someone who's lost a spouse to death. But for some reason, we expect someone who's gone through a divorce just to bounce back, just to get back out there. But that's not the way it works. It takes time. It takes time to heal those wounds. Now, there were studies done in the past, and there's several different models for how grief works. But the one that I like the best was developed by Helen Keebler-Ross, and it's 5 stages of grief. And it was initially developed for the loss of a loved one to death. But now we've come to realize that these stages of grief really apply to any loss. And the stages in a basic order, now we're going to get into this a little bit later, but they don't always come in this order. But the basic order that you will experience these stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. So when you get to acceptance, that's the point where you've really worked through the grieving process. And at that point, you're ready to move on. But it takes time to get there. It takes time to reach the point of acceptance. Now, we're going to go through each one of these stages in a little more detail so you can understand some of what goes on in these stages. And maybe you'll see yourself and see where you're at in one of these stages of grief. And you may be experiencing the results of multiple stages. But we'll start with denial. And denial is that phase usually right after you found out. Right after you found out that you're getting a divorce. It might have been before the word divorce was ever mentioned. This might have been when you found out that your spouse was cheating on you. This might have been the years that you accepted abuse from your spouse and you were in denial that it actually was abuse. But denial is the phase where you won't let yourself believe that you're getting divorced or that your spouse is cheating on you or any other number of things. This is the stage where you're just not willing to accept that what's happening in your life is really happening. You're in a state of shock. It's something where you just really can't function. And you tend to think that if you ignore it, it will just go away. But it's not going to happen. It's not just going to go away. And the longer you stay in denial, the harder it is to get out of it. And the harder it is to move on after you've come in and you've denied it for so long. You've denied what's happening for so long. It's very difficult to move past that denial and to accept that what's happening is really happening. But then once you finally do move past denial, once you accept that you are getting a divorce, it's very natural that you become angry. And anger, it's very natural. It's a natural reaction. Now, from a Christian perspective, we often associate anger with sin. If you're a believer, anger is often associated with sin, but it's not necessarily sin. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to a loss or a reaction to a harm that's perceived on yourself. But it must be controlled. You have to control your anger. And when you're angry, this is a phase where you're likely to make some stupid decisions. You're likely to say things or do things that will greatly complicate the divorce process. It can greatly complicate working with your ex or your soon-to-be ex to bring matters to closure. It can greatly complicate working with them as a co-parent. Some of the stupid things that you do when you're angry. Because words can be said, things can be done that stick with your ex for a long time. And it's hard to get over this. Anything you do to get back at your soon-to-be ex is really stupid. If you have a revenge mentality, it is going to just complicate the process that you are going to have to go through. You are going to have to work with this person on some level, even if you don't have children together. Because if you do have children together, you're going to be working together for a very long time. You're going to have to associate with this person and work together as parents for the best interests of your children for a long time. Well beyond the point where they're out of school, out of college. I mean, you're dealing with grandchildren's birthdays, birthday parties, weddings, all the different things where you're still going to have to interact with your ex. So try not to do things when you're angry that could affect how you interact with them 10, 15 years down the road. But even if you don't have children, you have to split up your assets. You have to come to some sort of agreement on how things are going to work after the divorce. You have to decide who's going to keep what car, who's going to keep the house, if anybody's going to keep the house. And if you can do that with a level head, rather than being angry, it will just make the whole process smoother. And you'll actually come out of it much better than if you do go into that with an angry attitude. Now, the big danger with anger is that you get stuck as an angry person. Because people who harbor anger for long periods of time, they end up bitter. And they end up the type of person that nobody wants to be around. So while anger is a very natural reaction to a loss, it's not something that you want to dwell on. Acknowledge you're angry, realize that anger is natural and even healthy to some degree. But don't dwell there and don't get stuck there. You've got to move on. If you've been angry at your ex for years, it's time to look for some sort of help to get past that. Now, the next stage is bargaining. And this is the stage where you will make deals with your ex. Or you make deals with God. You make statements like, if you just come back, I will change this. Or I will not do that. If you just come back, I will shut up about your drinking forever. If you just come back, I'll do whatever basically you're saying, I will do whatever it takes to get you back. And it's also a stage where people try to bargain with God. God, if you just restore my marriage, if you just make them see the light and come back, I will go to the mission field in Africa. Whatever. But you try to make bargains with God to try to get him to do what you want him to do. You try to manipulate him to solve the problem you have. And in this case, it's divorce. So you're trying to get him to restore the marriage or stop the divorce from happening if it hasn't happened yet. And this is another phase where stupid decisions occur because you make bargains trying to save a marriage and it's not healthy for the marriage. You're not addressing the core issues that got you to the point of divorce in the first place. And you can easily make agreements. You can agree to things that you will later regret just to try to save the marriage. And if you're not careful, you will bargain yourself into a situation that is not a healthy situation. Now, after bargaining, the next phase is depression. And depression, again, is natural. A mild depression is natural and it's even healthy. It slows the body down. It keeps us from, it gives us a chance to recover and recuperate from the intense emotions of anger and the pleading and begging of bargaining. You go into a depression and things just slow down and it gives you a chance to rewind, recoup, re-energize, reinvigorate. And that mild depression is natural. Now, if you get into a deep depression, if you get to the point where you cannot function, you need to get help and you need to get it immediately. Because a deep depression needs professional attention. You may need medication, you may need counseling services. You may need some sort of help to get you over the hump and get you out of that very deep depression. And finally, if you ever feel suicidal, you get help immediately. That's not something that you ever want to mess with. If you have suicidal thoughts, even if you don't think about acting on them, but if you just have thoughts that this would be a whole lot better if I would just check out, this is too tough to deal with. If you have thoughts like that, you need to get help and get professional help immediately. Now, the final stage is acceptance, and this is the goal. This is what we are working toward. And it doesn't mean that you agree that anything that happened during the divorce was okay. It doesn't mean that you do anything or that you agree with anything that happened. It just means that you've accepted it. It means that you have accepted what your new reality is. And it means that you are now ready to move on. It means that you're at a point where you have dealt with all of the issues of the divorce, or most of the issues of the divorce. You've dealt with them in a healthy manner. You are at a point where you can proceed with the rest of your life, and the divorce will now be a distant memory. But the problem is, it's not just divorce that you're grieving. The problem is that you're grieving multiple losses. There are multiple things that you lose during a divorce that makes it very difficult to get through this grieving process. And it is a series of grieving processes that are stacked on each other. You definitely lost the marriage, but you also lost companionship. You may have lost the person who you would think is your best friend up until the point where you were getting a divorce. You may have called your ex your best friend right up until the point where you found out the marriage was ending. So you've lost that companionship. You had shared dreams that you had dreams for retirement. You had dreams for vacations. You had dreams for playing with the grandkids. You had all of these dreams that you had talked about, that you had worked on together. You may have been saving money for some big goal that you have. You may have been saving money for a dream house. And it's just not going to happen anymore. Those dreams are gone. You may have also, or you will lose family. You've lost the intact family unit. You can't sit down all around the dinner table anymore. You can't go to church together. And that was one of the hardest things for me as I was going through my divorce, was actually sitting in church services alone. That was very difficult for me. And that loss of the family unit was all part of that. You lose in-laws. You may have had very close relations with in-laws that now won't talk to you anymore. You also lose a co-parent. If you have children, you lose someone there to help you with those children. Now, you can still effectively co-parent as divorced people, but that person is not there. If you're running late from work, they aren't there to get the kids off the bus. They're not there to help you with the daily chores around the house and dealing with the kids. You've lost that person who can give you some time alone when you need it. If you've had a hard day at work and you just need an hour to decompress, there's no one there to take the kids. Now, you've also lost financial status, very likely. Most people come through divorce and their standard of living has to change, because if you come from a two-income family, those two incomes were supporting one household. Now those two incomes have to support two households. So your standard of living by nature is going to go down. And there are very few people who come out of divorce better off financially than they went in. It happens occasionally, but it doesn't happen very often. And then you lose the social status, because in many ways we live in a couples-oriented society. So you lose that social status of being a couple. Things that you used to do as a couple, you don't have, or you can't do anymore. Couple friends that you used to hang out with. If you had a group of couple friends that you got together and went to dinner, played cards, whatever you did, well, you're single now and you just don't fit in with that same group of friends. So you're going to lose social status, and you'll very likely lose some friends over this. And friends tend to choose sides. So all of these losses are things that you need to grieve. And they each have their own grieving process associated with them. And it is a process. Now, here, if we look at, this little infographic I put together here, we start out with the divorce as the key thing that starts the grieving process. And with the divorce, you'll start down the trail of the grief process. And you'll move through denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And you may work pretty linearly through that trail for the divorce itself. But then as a result of the divorce, you lose some friends. And that loss of friends, again, may have its own grief process with it. But it can also contribute to the anger you feel because of the divorce. And then somewhere in here, after things have sort of stabilized, you realize that you've lost income. And again, that can trigger anger. It can trigger the fear of not knowing how you're going to deal with the loss of income, how you're going to deal with the difficulties, the financial difficulties you're facing, can throw you into a bargaining mode. That can make you think that you need to do whatever it takes to save this marriage just because you don't know how you're going to survive. And then that loss of income will have its own grief process associated with it. Now, another thing is these steps don't always happen in order. So you may skip the anger stage initially. You may go straight from denial to bargaining. And then when bargaining doesn't work, you get depressed. And then from depression, you go back to bargaining or you go back to anger. And you move in and out of these steps multiple times before you finally reach acceptance. But when you do reach acceptance, that's when you can understand that you are going to survive, that this is your new reality, that you are going to survive, and that it will be okay. Now, grieving takes time. It's something that we tend to think we can work through, that we'll be over this divorce, in a few weeks. At least that's what other people think. They don't want to give you the time it takes to really grieve the losses you've experienced. Widows and widowers often take years to bounce back. If you've lost someone to death, society does not expect you to bounce back immediately. But for some reason, people expect a new divorcee to just get on with life, to not let it affect them. So don't rush it. Don't rush yourself through the grieving process. Give yourself time to grieve. There is no certain time limit. Generally, the longer you were married, the longer it's going to take you to heal. But that's a general rule. In the divorce care material that I had the opportunity to teach for about 6 years and lead a group, there's experts in there that say it takes 1 year of healing for every 3 to 4 years of marriage, just as a rule of thumb. That basic timeline held true with me. I was married for 13 years. It took me about 5 years to really get over the marriage or the divorce. It took about 5 years to really heal. And, I did some things within that time that didn't help. But there were also people thinking that I should have been moving a whole lot faster than what I am. There is no certain time limit. Take the time you need, but be aware if you're stuck in something. Be aware that if you're stuck somewhere, you need to move on with the process. So now that was my presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions. Okay, did get a comment in the comment section. It said it helped to hear that there is more than just the divorce you grieve. And yes, that's something that people often don't think about. People don't think about the fact that there are so many losses with a divorce, and they compound on each other, and they're all interrelated, that it's very difficult to just get over it as people want you to do. It's difficult just to move on. It's difficult to accept the fact that your income has decreased, possibly as a result of some stupid actions of your ex, that you don't see your kids anymore on a regular basis, that you've lost friends because of it. And that's something that you can really struggle with. And just know that each one of those losses has its own grieving process associated with it. And there are losses associated with a divorce that are not associated with the death of a spouse. I've had the opportunity to work with people who have experienced both. They've lost a spouse to death, and they've experienced a divorce. And I can't say that this is universal. I can't say that everyone who experiences both feels this way, but the people I've had the opportunity to work with say the divorce is far worse than losing a spouse to death. So just keep that in mind if you are struggling to deal with all of the issues that are coming about as a result of your divorce. Keep in mind the fact that there are many things that you're experiencing that divorce is the only thing where you experience this many losses at once. Are there any other comments or questions? Viewer 10 says, I feel like I'm at the acceptance stage, but I'm struggling with how the divorce happened. I'm struggling with dealing that an affair helped lead to the divorce. Well, and that's part of, the many losses that you are struggling with. There's a series of losses, and the loss of the marriage is just one of them. And what you're really dealing with here is the betrayal of someone who you thought had your best interest at heart, the betrayal of someone who you thought was going to be there for you, someone who you thought you could trust, but that person let you down. And it's going to be very difficult. It's difficult to get over that when you are dealing with that deep sense of betrayal. It's difficult to move past that. But you can do it. You can move past that, but just realize that there's a grieving process for each one of these losses you faced. Well, I want to thank you for being part of this webinar. If you're watching live, thank you for taking the time out and watching it live. If you're watching it later, you didn't really miss anything. You're getting the same content that the people that were here live did. So with that, my new book is coming out within a month. It's called Surviving Divorce, Your Guide to Finding Hope and Healing After an Unwanted Divorce. And you can get your copy right now. You can get a PDF copy of this absolutely free by going to supportafterdivorce.com/web-book. And if you download, you got an email with a PDF version of these show notes. You can get that address there as well. And I will type it into the chat. And you can copy and paste in the chat window. I just put the link in there. You can copy and paste that to your browser. That will take you to the point where you can download the book. And that book will be free. A version of that book will be free until the book actually launches. So if you're watching this later and the book has launched, when you go to that web address, you will actually be taking to a link to purchase the book. But for the next 3 to 4 weeks or so, you can get the PDF copy of the book absolutely free. Now, many of you I know came through Facebook. I don't know where each one of you that's listening came from. If you don't listen to the Surviving Divorce podcast, I urge you to do that. You can find it at supportafterdivorce.com. That all the podcast episodes are listed there. But you can also find it on iTunes, the Surviving Divorce podcast. It's a weekly podcast that I produce that deals with a lot of these different issues. It deals with all sorts of issues related to divorce and just surviving divorce and coming out on the other side. It gives you hope and healing. It gives you hope that you can heal. Okay, so with that, we are going to finally wrap this up. I want to thank you for the comments and the questions. I want to thank you for participating. again, if you have any questions, just email me. You've got my email in the you've got my feedback email in the last email I sent you. There was a confusion there with the email address in the first email, but send me an email. Let me know if there's any questions you come up with after the webinar is over. So with that, I want to thank you again. Have a great rest of the day. And just know many people have gone through this before, and you will get through it. Other people are feeling the same way you are. You will get through it. Thank you.